Hi, I'm Dennis Metzler, and welcome to The Charge. Today we are taking a look at the nature of the soul with Dr. Joshua Farris. He is the Humboldt Experienced Researcher Fellow at the University of Bochum in Germany and the author of the book that we're taking a look at today, The Creation of Self, A Case for the Soul. So the link is posted below. Check it out. Dr. Farris, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, good to be with you. Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Alrighty, so first let's get some personal background to let the listeners know where you're coming from theologically and your church background.
Yeah. So, ecclesially, my church background and theologically, I grew up as charismatic. I was raised in charismatic churches and raised with kind of a basic Christian worldview, basic Christian morality, what we conceive of basic sort of traditional morality. Some of which we took for granted back then, uh, which are not taken for granted so much anymore. Some ideas that would be considered traditional. But I was raised with sort of basic moral knowledge of what we believe as Christians, with sort of according to the Ten Commandments and things of that sort. We were a part of Assemblies of God churches for many years growing up. And so that was part of my formative process. I learned a lot about prayer from my brothers and sisters in the charismatic circles, as well as the gifts of the Spirit and those sorts of things, and miracles, the miraculous, and these kinds of things. And I've continued to have some sort of connection with them throughout my life, and some who are, I guess, now in the Vineyard movement as well. But later on, late in my high school years and in college years, I really started asking a lot more questions, asking a lot more about the Bible. I didn't feel like I had received a lot of biblical knowledge growing up, kind of basic knowledge, but not a lot of emphasis on really sort of having a daily devotional, but also having regular study time of the Bible. And how the Bible impacts my life directly. And so I started looking to the Baptist, and particularly one mentor who became something of a mentor to me. Who was a pastor at the time, an interim pastor and things. And he was kind of a mentor to me. It was very helpful in grounding me in a richer way, a more sturdy way, and in a sort of broader biblical worldview and framework. And so it was the Baptist that I gained a lot of my bearings about my worldview and my thinking and approaching the world. That was very informative. And leading into my college years, which continued to be informative, I had several teachers who were kind of, to some extent, disciplers or mentors to me, and very helpful. Later on, when I was in my graduate work and postgraduate work, I started to get a sense of like the connectedness of history. And I started to believe, well, there is actually a history in Christianity. There's a real history there. And I need to make some sense of it. In some ways, it really should, more than implicitly, inform how I think about the world and how I think about the Bible and, approach the Bible. And so I started thinking about liturgy and these sorts of things. And eventually I became an Anglican. And I've kind of stayed in the world of Anglicanism, and have fallen in love with the liturgy as well as the Book of Common Prayer, which has been I think a good way to put it is a stabilizing practice in Christianity. I mean, obviously, in Christianity, evangelicalism, there's a big emphasis upon, your kind of conversion experience and kind of more radical high mountain experiences, which are good. And hopefully we have those throughout our life. But there's also the stable realities of ongoing, just, kind of faithful prayer, Bible intake, liturgy, um, partaking of the supper with other believers, and these sorts of things that are stabilizing Christian realities. And so that's where I'm at with in terms of my background. And I'm also ordained as an Anglican minister, and so that has been a very formative time. The last few years since I've been in that process. And so it's been good.
Okay. So you write the book, The Creation of the Self. What's your motivation behind it? What are you trying to get at? And why do we need to go into all these details about the nature of the self or the origin of the self? Isn't it enough just to believe that we have life after death?
Yeah, yeah, those are good questions. So I think there's a lot there that could be answered. See how much how brief I can keep it, and then we can talk about more of it. But the creation of the self is a book largely about God and his relationship to the soul. And the soul I'm taking to be the kind of the core part of who you are, the essential part of you, the part that makes you you, the personal part of you that is intimately tied to who God is. It's overlapping with God. And with all the discussions right now that are taking place, not only in theology as well as in philosophy about personal identity, subjectivity, fascinating discussions are taking place right now. There are also simultaneous discussions right now at the intersection of these, as well as science and as well social sciences, regarding the nature of self and subjectivity and identity. All sorts of questions right now about identity in the contemporary culture that are taking place. Lots of questions, lots of views that are held that are ambiguous and confusing and arguably concerning and very problematic. But these are like right in our face, and there's a lot of discussion to be had right now. I mean, there's even been several books, not only about the nature of consciousness, which I take to be related to the nature of the self and personal identity, but the nature of the self itself has been written on, and there's been several books written by psychologists recently, as well as social scientists, who are arguing for views that kind of certainly reject any sort of view that we are souls or immaterial substances or mental substances in the way that somebody like Descartes would have argued or early on, but we are something like individuals that are autonomous and make our own identity, or we're individuals that are sort of part of a collective whole, and that collective whole determines our identity, but there is no objective identity about that apart from the community itself or the social construction within that community itself. And so this is a right discussion that has right implications for all sorts of issues that are at the heart of morality, how we live, how we live a flourishing life, how we think about technology. And so it's important in that way. And it's motivated by some of those concerns, but I'm getting at a more fundamental issue in the book in trying to make um, part of the book is for a mainstream intellectual audience. Part of it's more probably still more academic and is a contribution to those discussions. But I'm making an argument within personal identity that the soul is the core of the person, that the soul is the core of the person that makes the person that person rather than another person. And that points us to God and is intimately overlapping with God as the explanatory framework for how we make sense of selves and souls. We need that framework if we're going to make sense of ourselves and souls. And that's the argument, basically. And it's kind of just hearkening back to an older view that's consonant with or similar to the sort of the Platonic or the Augustinian views of souls and selves that were quite popular throughout much of Christian history, even amongst even amongst Thomas Aquinas, although he has different views, he would articulate differently. And then, of course, later Rene Descartes. But there's this fundamental heart issue that I think is really Platonic and Augustinian in nature, that is really at the heart or the kind of the drive of many of the early fathers' reflections, theological reflections on the nature of what it means to be a human that's at stake. And so these issues are overlapping. And after kind of several years of researching the soul, human constitution, and even more so their implications for an older discussion amongst theologians early on, the origin of the soul, I began to realize that there's a pretty strong argument for not only this intimate overlap, it's kind of sign pointer that some philosophers would call it, but actually a kind of strong argument even for the existence of God as a necessary entity to make sense of souls, where souls become created directly and probably immediately by a kind of being, a personal and powerful being, something like God. And probably it's implicit in the book, and I get there, but probably the Christian God even makes the best sense of this. And I think there are, other further arguments that can be developed that kind of solidify that, yeah, when we're identifying God as the creator, as the causal agent, that is this personal, powerful being that brings us about in biological evolution or the biological world in which we're in. It is this causal agent that brings it about, who is God, and probably the Christian God. And apart from this causal explanation, we have these different explanations that are on offer, particularly in the more science and religion discussions, trying to make sense of our own origins. So there's still this ripe human origins discussions in science and religion. It's not really a discussion about the origin of the soul like the early fathers or the theologians were talking about, because, well, the soul's largely been rejected amongst many of the scientists, especially those in the science and religion fields, in favor of some sort of more a physicalist, what you would call physicalist view, that we are physical all the way through and through, all the way down, all the way up, that we are biological products of evolution, and that is what makes sense of us. That is the explanation for us, not only for how we come to be, but it's a sufficient, it's presumed that it's sufficient explanation for our origins and who we are. So this human origins discussion, I don't get deep into. It certainly has relation and implications for it. I don't get deep into the discussions about talks today about neo-Darwinianism and other discussions related, like intelligent design and these sorts of things. But it certainly has implications for that, and I think it leans in favor of some kind of, obviously, some sort of intelligent design, if not at least some sort of theistic, robust, strong theistic explanation that requires God as the causal explanation in the world. But there is a kind of so this fits with the kind of what philosophers have called theistic dualism, and I'm arguing that there is this close relationship between soul and God, and that without God we can't make sense of the soul. Without the soul, we can't make sense of God. Going back to even Calvin's Institutes, he begins his whole framing of his theological discussions in the Institutes around this question, this epistemic question about God and the soul. Knowledge of God and soul are largely interchangeable. He's doing really a Platonic kind of Augustinian thing there, which certainly Descartes later picks up. Thomas kind of does this, but it's different. It's a little different. But it's certainly this overwhelming emphasis that these two ideas are so foundational to the world that to excise them, we can't make sense of everything else in the world. We're unable to make sense of everything in the world. And so obviously that has some ramifications for other discussions that maybe we'll talk about as well. But
Right.
there is this generalizable process, regular process, that cannot make sense of us and how it is that we came into being in the world. And so I go beyond a kind of theistic dualism to a kind of creationist dualism, that God is required as the causal agent that brings us about, you and I, about directly and probably immediately in the course of our biological history. However, we make sense of kind of evolutionary discussions, which I don't get into in detail. Although obviously it would exclude certain evolutionary positions, but we don't have to go there right now. But there's this more fundamental issue about consciousness and the particularity of consciousness that requires God as the explanation. Yeah.
Okay,
So that
so
was a mouthful.
as far as the materialistic option, naturalistic, physicalist, there are Christians, evangelical believers, particularly at Fuller, Joel Green, etc., who hold to a materialist view. So how do they defend that from the scriptures, and particularly how do they understand life after death if there's no immaterial soul?
Hmm. Yeah. So there are, um, yeah. So I do in the book I do address both the theologians and the philosophers in different ways, and I think they're both operating from similar underlying philosophical frameworks or commitments about the nature of persons as material beings. And so there are motivations there that are deeply philosophical and hermeneutical. Of course, Joel Green, in several of his books, he makes some of these philosophical or hermeneutical commitments very clear. Um, uh, Particularly, but there are biblical rationales that have been given that someone like Joel Green has offered in favor of a view that explicitly denies that we're souls and explicitly affirms that we are physical beings or sophisticated, complicated bodies of some sort. And he would argue that, in fact, he argues this in several places. Um, One is in the Rutledge or the Ashgate Research Companion to Theological Anthropology that I edited years ago. He argues when he's talking about the image of God that the old notion that, or the traditional, he even calls it traditional notion that imago Deis or image bearers are identified with souls is not only outdated and the science doesn't buttress it, right? He makes these sorts of arguments, but he says the biblical material doesn't support it either. And he would say that when we look at he kind of makes two or three different arguments. One is when we look at the lexical work, he says there's no good reason with the later manuscripts that we have textually that we should affirm or translate anything in Scripture, the Old Testament or New Testament, as a soul or as referring to a kind of immaterial, distinct substance from the body. And in fact, when we look at the creation story itself, the story itself highlights or emphasizes the reality that we are holistic beings, holistically integrated, and there is no bifurcation between the soul and body, certainly no separation of the soul and body, which he thinks something like dualism implies. It implies this robust separation of soul and body. And so he says, well, that's kind of in the Old Testament worldview, that's in the creation story, the way that God talks about the human, that's out of the kind of out of the picture. It's out of the worldview framework of the authors, and it doesn't fit with their creational perspective on human beings themselves. He really solidifies this argument, which has become a common push amongst contemporary Christian materialists, wherein they would say that not only is it not found there, and the creation story doesn't yield that kind of picture of a kind of a soul that could become disembodied, but in fact, the whole narrative of Scripture, the whole redemptive frame, pushes us toward physical resurrection of the body. And because of this emphasis upon physical resurrection of the body, there is really no place within our worldview framework for even thinking or conceiving of the possibility of a soul that's distinct from the body or that could even potentially exist without the body. And that's outside of the framework altogether. The scriptures don't give us that. The scriptures tell us all about the eschaton, which is resurrection. It's not this disembodied existence. It's not a heavenly existence, at least in the way that some of the ancients would describe it, or the way that Plato would describe it. We're not like in heaven without kind of, after having slept off our bodies, kind of floating around on the clouds, or even floating around in this sort of realm that is wholly non bodily, wholly non physical, are non-tangible. It's not like that, and the scriptures don't give us that picture at all. So that would be the sort of argument of Joel Green, Nancy Murphy, and others who are at the fuller, who have really pushed this line, as well as others like Richard Middleton, who have really been kind of he's an Old Testament scholar who's really been, who wrote the book Liberating Image, where he explicitly rejects the soul kind of idea and the image of God. And he's been really kind of he's really pushed this line quite strong that there is no place for the soul in the Christian worldview, given what we have in Scripture and how we ought to read the Scriptures. So hopefully that gives a
Okay.
sufficient picture of what's going on there.
Okay, so then you spend some time talking about human experience and using reason and logic to point to the reality of the soul. How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, so this the creation of self is really, you might think of it as more of a natural theology of human personhood or human identity. So even in the arguments that I set up, where I spend some time criticizing the theologians that we just talked about, like Joel Green and others, I'm really doing so more from a philosophical vantage point and criticizing their underlying commitments and hermeneutics, as well as pointing to the fact, this sort of underlying fact about the soul and its particularizing feature that makes souls the kinds of things that they are. Um, I'm really pressing in on that and trying to make sense of that um, from experience and from reason, which I take to be um, kind of basic ways in which we know the world. We have to begin here to some extent. We have to begin an experience, not isolated solipsist experience, not experience that is arguably kind of partitioned off as a kind of brain in a vat that can only experience its sort of simulation, like the Matrix, but a kind of experience that is rooted in reality, that is a kind of realism. But but so I'm making an argument, kind of in one way, really independent of any sort of premises that are coming from revelation itself or from biblical revelation, at least in this book. And so I'm trying to highlight through the nature of experience, particularly phenomenal experience, where phenomenal experiences, well, it's the basic experience we have of ourselves in the world, and it's kind of the fundamental epistemic starting point, arguably, that we all begin with. We all begin with this kind of phenomenal experience, and arguably maybe some rational ideas that are intuitions that we begin with in order to make sense of the world, to kind of logically kind of make sense of identity. This thing is not this thing. This thing has these properties. This thing has these other properties and these sorts of things. But we begin with this sort of qualitative experience that I experience the world and I experience it as like this. I experience this sort of likeness quality, and it's this sort of phenomenal quality that I think is fascinating. That recently, especially in the last 60 years, there's been a renaissance of literature on the consciousness studies. And then there's relatedly been a renaissance of reflection on how consciousness relates to personal identity, if in fact it does. And I think it does. I mean, I think any sort of basic notion of the self is going to take it that our consciousness is somehow related, and that what's basic to my being myself is and my personal interactions with others is the fact that I have a concept of the self, and I have a first person perspective, and I have access arguably to my first person perspective, and there is something of what it is like to be me and not you, and you same way. And so these qualitative experiences are quite fascinating for philosophical reasons. And so through this line and through understanding our own knowledge about ourselves in relation to the world, our own consciousness, and various features about our own phenomenal consciousness, it seems that we can say a lot about ourselves, and in fact, we must begin here if we're going to think or know or understand anything about ourselves as well as the rest of the world. It seems properly basic. It seems to be the immediate way in which we know, and different types of knowledge, particularly knowledge about physical things, becomes mediated by this kind of phenomenal knowledge that we do have of ourselves and that we must begin here. But it's highly unique in some ways also, and deserving of our reflection.
All right. So, how about neuroscience? What can we learn from the best neuroscience research? What does that tell us about the soul or not?
Yeah, so neuroscience is interesting. There's been some recent studies in neuroscience, neuroscience of consciousness and neuroscience of the self studies that there's been a lot of work on what's called the neural correlates of consciousness. And so basically, that is the sort of correlative relation between brains or the neurons within the brain that correlate in some way to self, to personal experiences, to say pain. There might be a certain neuron that commonly triggers that we can map out on a brain map that correlates to painful feelings or feelings of what it's like to experience different colors and things of that sort. And so there's lots of fascinating work on that. And there's a lot of work being done on um, kind of what you would call theories of the mind uh, by neuroscientists, or at least philosophically inclined neuroscientists, that are trying to make sense of the mind as an entity by way of neuroscience. And so there's been a flurry of literature on this that's fascinating. There's been several consciousness studies institutes and centers that have been sort of propped up as kind of raising these different questions about the nature of the self and experience and conscious experience. Fascinating stuff. There's different theories of the mind that are related to sort of mechanical computation, as well as information theories that have been put forward. And what's interesting is that when you look at many of the neuroscientists, like take, for example, Kai Voegeli and Sean Gallagher, who are famous neuroscientists who have reflected on and done work on the neuroscience of self and consciousness. Interesting, when you look at their work, they are very they well, let's take one particular essay. I wrote a paper on this and kind of exploring kind of what I would call their sort of minimalist or implicit Cartesianism. There is this common sort of assumption amongst the neuroscience literature or neuroscientist experts that 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 commonly and consistently, when they're talking about the self, they talk about it in dualistic ways, in the way that Descartes did. And they make this at least implicit distinction between the self, mental properties, experiential properties or qualities, and as distinct from sort of quantitative properties that can be measured by way of empirical means of sort of brain scans and these sorts of things, and they can develop all sorts of data about it. But there's this implicit dualism that is present throughout. And interestingly, Voegeli and Sean Gallagher, they begin in several places, one place in particular, where they say we need to get rid of all this metaphysics talk and get to the hard sciences. And by so doing this, we can actually map out a science of the self and consciousness. We can do this. And so they say we need to get rid of the metaphysics. Excuse me. We need to avoid what Karl Popper and and um, who was the famous neuroscientist, I'm blanking on his name at the moment, who wrote, co-authored with Karl Popper, Eccles. They wrote this famous book from their research, and anyway, they make these. They basically end up defending a kind of Cartesian dualism, which got a lot of like pushback from later neuroscientists who are like Vogely, who are saying, well, this is outdated. This is kind of metaphysical speculation. You don't need to do this. Let's get rid of this, and let's get back to the hard sciences, like someone like the physicalist Daniel Dennett would do. So what they do is they spin this essay doing these elaborate things where they can map out all these things in the brain, and all these things that are going on in the brain, and so they can talk and say all sorts of things about the correlations between the brain and our experiences in the world. And what they end up doing, though, is when they start talking about the self, they say we can actually have a science of the self. They actually have to do quite a bit of language adoption that actually ends up arguably eschewing the properties of phenomenal consciousness and experience with the neural properties of which they are saying there's correlations. So they have to assume a language adoption in order to eschew the properties in which they're talking about from their own neuroscientific study. And by so doing, they implicitly create this sort of ambiguity in their own neuroscience by saying, look, here's the neural correlate. There is this qualitative experience that we can predicate of the neural correlate through this language adoption. But what they end up doing is saying, well, it's this neural correlate is doing this thing in this part of the brain, and it's here. We can point to it in the brain map. But this experience that is being experienced, it's here too, but just not in the same way that the physical thing is there. So they end up doing this kind of weird kind of internalism. It's a technical term in philosophy where they predicate internally these qualitative properties to these quantitative properties that are mapped in brain studies, and then they say that it is here, but it's not here in the same way that the physical property that we can measure is here. So it becomes this mysterious thing that it's kind of magical how they do it. And it sounds very highfalutin scientific, but they end up just affirming something that some philosophers have dubbed or called Cartesian materialism. That there are these properties of physical, conscious, phenomenal experience. They're here where these physical correlates are, yeah, but they're not here in the same way. And we can't articulate what that means, but they're there, right? They're just there. You just need to assume it, and we need to run with this program. So anyway, hopefully that makes some sense. I may have been a bit long-winded there, but there is this interesting thing going on in neuroscientific studies that ends up actually being not only implicitly dualistic, where there are these two distinct types of properties that are being talked about that are kind of conflated, but they actually end up using language that becomes skewed, that actually sounds a lot like what René Descartes was actually saying early on about these sorts of properties that are substantially distinct from one another. And so there's actually been some literature suggesting that, the neuroscientists of the self are kind of fraught with this implicit sort of Cartesianism that they can't get out of. And but they constantly reject it, and they constantly try to seek to use these sort of methods and then these promissory notes, which is quite common of materialists today, both philosophical and scientific materialists, that will make promissory notes that, hey, we need to go down this line. We need to take it as far as we can go. And eventually we're going to be able to explain consciousness, but they haven't explained consciousness yet in any sort of empirical or naturalistic way. But hey, we're going to, and here's how we're going to do it. But it's going to happen down the road. And so Sean Gallagher and Kai Vogley in that very same article end up on that note. They say, well, we need to reject metaphysics, but then they end up toward the end adopting metaphysics, and then they say, well, we need, well, we're going to figure it out eventually. And so there's all these promissory notes, but there's a problem. There's a problem, and the problem seems to be that these two fundamentally distinct types of properties cannot be explained or reduced to the other properties. They are, and in fact, one in some ways is epistemically prior to the other. In order to know, say, for example, physical things, we must know certain things about ourselves and about our own conscious states of awareness. And this is implicates certain aspects about reality, certain features of reality, and so we do have at a minimum this kind of property dualism that defies any sort of materialist reduction or materialist explanation that is sufficient for making sense of our own conscious experiences.
All right. Okay, speaking of science, it seems to me that veridical near-death experiences, NDEs, are the most telling evidence we have that there's something going on beyond the material world. So if you could explain what a veridical NDE is, and then how you see that as relating to this whole argument about the nature of the soul or existence of the soul.
So yeah, so veridical would be those experiences, those near-death experiences that are reports of sensory experiences of present circumstances that are corroborated later by other reports that are made by those who are not dead, who have, for example, there have been lots of cases where people who are on kind of their surgical bed, where doctors are kind of working on them, and they have this. They're even pronounced dead by the doctors, and during that encounter, the person is actually having a sensory experience of being above the body, or at least being around the body, so as to see what's going on during that operation, and able to even hear and see things that are taking place, things that the doctors and nurses are talking about during the operation or whatever. And they're actually able to not only account for through their reports of general things, but very particular, specific things that are said during that time. In which case, if they were dead, and if they were pronounced dead, and being pronounced dead, they were wholly material beings, then they would be non-operational. They would not be functioning. They wouldn't be hearing, seeing things in the room in the way that they're reporting that they are. So the indication seems to be that there's something else going on with persons than their bodies. Their bodies have certain possibilities that are distinct from their own possibilities as persons, that can somehow exist and even sensorially experience the world around them, presumably even apart from their bodies, or apart from their body that's on the surgical bed where the operation is taking place. And this seems to indicate that something else is going on. And for the substance dualist, this is very natural in one sense. It's very natural because, that's what we would expect. We would expect at least the possibility that the person could have experiences or exist or persist even though their body is not functioning at all, and their body is in this alternative state, this state of being dead. We would expect that the person itself would exist beyond that or persist beyond that and even have experiences beyond that or sensorial experiences. Um, and so this is very natural in light of uh, one's commitments to substance dualism, the notion that we are two distinct or composed of two distinct types of substances, one bodily, one soulish, one that's described or characterized by phenomenal properties of consciousness, and the other primarily characterized by physical properties or properties that are quantitative, that are measurable. We would expect that on that sort of view, yeah, NDEs or even out of body experiences are possible. And so, but if materialism is true, then there would be no sufficient explanation for how it is that 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 those persons could exist beyond or apart from their bodies. It would be logically, by definition, impossible.
Yet materialists do make an argument. I don't understand their argument. I'm fully aware of what's happening during veridical NDEs. So, do they have any argument at all from your consideration?
Yeah. I haven't. There are lots of different responses that they make. Yeah. Um, some of them actually don't explain these more particular NDEs where they're able to recount um, what's being said about um, or what's being said from the doctors when they're pronounced dead. Um, some would account, some make, kind of generic kind of explanations that, well, the brain is still kind of functioning. It experiences these flashes of lights, this overwhelming flood of emotions that comes from the sort of neurochemistry that is taking place. Others would say that, well, you're if you are literally pronounced dead, you are literally dead because your body's dead and you are your body, so that makes you dead. Then they would say something like, there's something of a kind of a narratival process that takes place where you have these memories and these experiences of similar circumstances in life, and even relatedly more immediate experiences of being on the bed and hearing the doctors, and through some sort of imaginative process you're able to fill in some of the details. So after you're kind of brought back to life, as it were, you're able to kind of piece together a narrative and relay that narrative in a way that makes you believe that you are still present at that time.
Hmm.
And
Yet the
so,
doctor's testimonies say no, the detail of what they talked about and what actually happened is way too specific. It's not something that they would pick up by reading books or through any sort of common knowledge.
yeah, I think, yeah, that seems right. Yeah. So I remember, I think it was a recent show they talked about. They gave that sort of explanation. It was either Sam Harris's show or Sean Carroll's show. I can't remember, but they were recently giving that explanation, and I remember listening to it and thinking, yeah, I don't think this is an explanation for all the details of very particular NDE experiences. I don't think this does justice to it. So there still seem to be grasping in the dark and sort of kind of reaching for plausible explanations that they can sort of develop as they're fumbling in the dark. I don't think there are any good materialist explanations of these sorts of very particular veridical near-death experiences that people have had. Lots of people have had. Um,
Okay. Well, that's good. Well, how about
yeah,
you mentioned something about Cartesianism. So, what is the neo-Cartesian understanding that you have, and how is it relevant to the soul?
yeah. So neo-Cartesianism. How is neo-Cartesianism relevant to my understanding of the soul and to Cartesianism itself?
Yeah, and what is it in the first place?
Yeah. So I'm kind of building on what's what many would consider to be a sort of Cartesian view of persons as souls. And so I'm kind of working within this sort of broader tradition of Cartesianism that goes back or harkens back to Rene Descartes and his view that is commonly today called substance dualism, or a version of substance dualism, that we are kind of souls plus bodies, and that there is this interactive relation between our souls and bodies, this sort of functional integration, that we experience the world through our bodies, but we ourselves are souls, or we ourselves are identified by our souls. And so, in many ways, it's largely Cartesian in nature. Um, Neo-Cartesianism is a uh, kind of an update, kind of modification, a building on some of the core ideas within Descartes and within the Cartesian tradition that he inspired. Um, and there are a few of us around who would claim this title of neo-Cartesianism, and we would say that, in large measure we're Cartesian. We agree with some of the sort of the essential ideas of that shape Descartes' understanding of personhood. We take seriously the utterly unique properties of the mind and of consciousness as being irreducible to material properties, to neurons firing, even to functions in the brain. We take these as being utterly unique properties. We take the first person perspective very seriously as even fundamental to our epistemic wherewithal, as having even some sort of metaphysical implication for who we are. It's not just something that is grammatical. It's not something that's simply epistemic even, but it is epistemically foundational. We take the I seriously, that there is an actual I, and that this is related to the self and soul, or that it's related to the self as a soul. There is this ineliminable I. There's lots of interesting literature on this, but this really is at its heart a Cartesian idea that Descartes really highlighted and made very clear in his writings. We also take seriously the authority of the I, which is related to that, that there is some sort of authority that an I has. And even in the trivial sense, trivial in one sense, trivial, not trivial in another sense, trivial in the sense that, uh, in one sense, epistemically, we have to take seriously our own ideas, right? And the implicit I therein that has access to those ideas. So there is some sort of authority in the I. There's some sort of epistemic authority. And this is really something that Descartes really highlights in his meditations. Um, so it's trivial in the sense that it's almost, if you're at all a realist about epistemic properties. This here I'm getting into sort of more technical philosophy. If you're a realist at all about those sorts of properties, then you would have to uh, then you have to affirm this kind of minimally Cartesian idea about the authority of the I in your own epistemic wherewithal. If you're an anti-realist, then um, well, that's another story. Uh, Descartes still going to be sort of seems in the background somewhere, but that's a more complicated discussion. But so Cartesians, neo-Cartesians take this seriously. So it's trivial in that sense and not trivial in another sense. But there's also this notion of the irreducible cogito. Um, the cogito, I think, therefore I am, is irreducible to anything um, in the physical nature in the brain. It's not reducible to the brain or neurons firing or the functions of neurons firing or the events that occur as a result of the neurons firing and things of that sort. It's not reducible at all. In fact, as one philosopher put it, there is this unavoidable cogito that is fundamental to our how we know the world and has implications for what it is that makes us who we are, who I am, and who you are. And so, as Cartesians, we take that seriously. Neo-Cartesianism, in the way that I develop it, builds on those ideas for sure and takes it in the direction of really highlighting or isolating this notion of subjectivity and even particularity of minds or particularity of individual consciousnesses, and takes that as a serious sort of philosophical point of reflection that needs to be made sense of or given some kind of explanation to. And if it's real, and I take it to be real, then there are these unique features that occur or that make sense of subjectivity and particularity that is really a kind of building on Cartesianism, but developing it further in a way that may have been implicit in Descartes or the Cartesian tradition, but may not be explicit. And so that's kind of what I mean by neo-Cartesian. I take it that we are fundamentally our souls, that we are identical to our souls, that it is our souls that carry along personal identity, and that there is even further, this further fact about each individual soul, that each individual soul is that soul and not some other soul. And there is this fundamental or primitive fact about each soul that makes it that soul rather than another soul and distinguishes one soul from another soul. And it's that fascinating, mysterious, unique property that is at one level, obviously it is mysterious and but it's something that we have access to. It's something that upon reflection we have direct access to if we know anything in the world at all, but it's something that defies explanation by common philosophical terms concerning parts and properties and these sorts of things. It's something else. And this is where my neo-Cartesianism really starts pushing me down this theistic direction, because then we start having to reflect on, well, how does that thing, and this gets us back to the whole origin of the soul discussion, which I think needs to be revived again in Human Origins. It points us back again to this fascinating fact about, well, how does that thing even come into existence then? On the kind of explanations that we typically have that are on offer in science, science doesn't do it justice. The empirical discussions don't make sense of this. The bottom-up processes that we have that make sense of human origins and individual human origins that come into existence at a time don't make sense of, or can't make, it doesn't seem that they can make sense of this unique fact. So this is where it really starts pushing me, and I try to really develop this later on in the book, that this unique fact requires a unique explanation. And this is where God is necessary as an explanation, or something like God, probably the Christian God, but something like God is necessary.
All right, so you're talking about origins, so that brings us to the variety of possible origin stories. So what would be the big three: materialism, panpsychism, and especially emergentism. What's your understanding of them, the relevance of them, and your critique of them?
Mm. Yeah, good. So this gets to the kind of competitors or positions that I spend most of the time criticizing in the book. And as we were talking about origin, at first when you used the word origin, I thought you might have been referring to Origin, which is kind of the same, the theologian Origin in
Right,
history,
right.
which he has a an important place in this discussion, actually. But um, the origin of the soul discussion is kind of brought back in, I think, in this way, in a unique and fresh way than it had been in much of history. And particularly, it's brought to the fore when we start looking at this, the questions of consciousness, but not just general consciousness, but particular consciousnesses that come into existence contingently at a time. And when we think about those questions, and we're confronted with these other alternative questions, well, they too have their own origin stories, and it's here that we have this origin of the soul question come up afresh again in an important way that brings us back to the old discussion. Um, and um, so so I really spent a lot of time kind of criticizing kind of the materialistic views of persons or agents, um, panpsychist agents, as well as emergentism. And in some ways, all of them have, at least the secular panpsychist views, as well as the emergentist views, have their kind of a kind of close relationship or kinship, you might say, to materialism. They have a kinship to materialism insofar as they're committed to a broadly kind of naturalistic worldview or naturalistic frame, at least in terms of their origin stories, and how it is the process that brings about the final product of the emergent self, which emergent is a fluid term that's used in very kind of elastic ways that materialists use, as well as dualists of our different varieties would use to make sense of their position. The most exotic kind of emergentism view is a view. Well, there are a couple, but really one of them is William Hasker's view, who has a view called the emergent self. So the book is actually kind of, to some extent, riffing off of um, that title. But in his emergent self, he develops a kind of view that is broadly naturalistic, or at least arguably pseudo naturalistic. It comes from a material base insofar as the soul, he does believe in a soul. He does, and he understands the soul to be a kind of thing, an individual thing that's locatable, countable, and that it bears its own properties. And he would say that it must be a kind of a novel substance of a sort, a substance being the kind of thing that owns properties or bears the properties or has properties. And it has to be its own substance um, because of these unique types of properties that we've been talking about, namely mental or consciousness properties that are distinct from their physical properties or physical correlates, bodily properties, neural properties, these sorts of things. And so he takes seriously the mind and its properties. And he would argue, in fact, that there has to be a substance of this novel sort. But his whole origin story of how he gets there is that it is somehow, um, I don't know, you wouldn't probably want to use the word designed, but it's somehow designed in the fabric of the physical universe that at some level of sophistication, biological sophistication and complexity, the brain gives rise to a soul or a mental substance that bears its own unique properties. And it is the um, not necessarily there's there a causal relationship, but there's a logical relationship such that when these different parts come together, a sufficiently complex brain and central nervous system, then we have a mental subject, a subject of consciousness itself. But the process itself is just like the sort of biological evolution process. It comes about through biological evolution, as do these other physicalist options on offer. So there is a kind of a kinship between them, you might say. And this is how I am kind of using the word pseudo-naturalism in the book. Panpsychism, at least of the secular variety, is working from within the same framework. It's doing the same thing, and it would provide a similar origin story as its materialist competitors. Now, it takes seriously the mind in a way that most materialists do not. It takes seriously the irreducible nature of these mental properties, that they cannot be explained. Um, Not only does it require more than predicate dualism, but property dualism. That there are these properties that cannot emerge from their physical base or from complex physical arrangements, but they must be somehow present in the world from the very beginning. In the same way that particles are there, there must be something like um, mindlets, mind properties, or dispositional properties that are qualitative in nature that exist at the very foundation of the natural world with particles. So particles either with them or they have these qualitative dispositional nature. But the same process that you would see from a materialist or an emergentist, that is kind of this bottom up process whereby there are these certain laws that give rise to higher order organisms, will at some point in biological evolution give rise to um, mental subjects or minds themselves. And so they're giving in not to not not to trivialize their other distinctives and the importance that they offer in terms of other concerns about the nature of consciousness, but the origin process is very similar. And so there's this problem for all of them, it seems to me, in the book, and it has to do with this particularizing feature of minds itself as um, being non-reproducible in a way um, that would render problematic the origin story that they have in place already for minds. Minds are not the kinds of things, in other words, that can be reproduced as if reproduced in a lab. If you have all the right conditions in place and you have the right processes, given the right laws, then it could give rise either deterministically, depending on your views of how the world works, or probabilistically to the very same mind. This defies a kind of universalizable process. It defies a kind of regular process. In fact, minds that even come into existence, if they are like emergent minds, which I have some sympathies for, the kind of the emergentism that Hasker puts forward, where there is this tight functional integration between mind and body, when the mind begins to exist, it begins to exist as an embodied reality that has sort of tight laws and designed purposes and ends, um, ultimately explained by God, but nonetheless fixed in this sort of embodied way that looks in some ways very much like kind of emergent soul. But uh, but but the um, but the process itself is problematic if it has to come about in this universalizable, predictable, regular way, where these minds seem to be, if they are emergent, they seem to be more like singularities in nature rather than regular lawful products of nature. And so if that's the case, um, well, that seems problematic because the very nature of the subject itself, the particularizing feature that makes the subject itself, is non-anonymous. It's not an anonymous thing. And it's not a thing that can be made sense of by even its own external properties or relational properties in the world. So it would be insufficient to say that what makes me me, or what is sufficient to make me me, is the fact that I occupy this one place at this particular time in history. Um, that doesn't seem sufficient. There seems to be more that makes me me, that is sufficient for making me me. But um, in the same way that like a blow dryer or something can be reproduced over and over and over again, and it's the same blow dryer, you can make these trivial distinctions between the blow dryers and say this blow dryer is not this blow dryer, even though they have all the same properties, they function in the same way, they do the same stuff, they look the same in every way, and we can rely on them because the company makes them in exactly the same patterned way, regular way that they always have made them. They do the same thing, they act in the same way. And so, in terms of sufficient explanations, we have the sufficient explanation to make sense of each blow dryer as being the same kind of thing. Now, you could trivially say, well, this blow dryer obviously isn't the same as this other blow dryer because, well, it's this one, it's over here. And that's a that's an obvious way to point out the distinction that this one's not this one because it's over here. Well, we could switch them up, and would that make any difference? Well, it would make an accidental difference, but it makes no fundamental intrinsic difference to the thing itself. Whereas souls do have a fundamental intrinsic difference that makes them the kinds of souls that they are from other souls. And so without that fundamental intrinsic difference, we're left with these sorts of external differences or relational differences that are insufficient for making what seems to be the case with selves as souls themselves. But if they are just like physical products that are reproducible in nature in the same way, then at least in theory, we could reproduce the same soul over and over again, given the same conditions and same laws, with all the same matter, material parts that are present underlying it and giving rise to it. But that would then seem that would undermine this deeper fact about ourselves that we know to be true, that we have access to upon reflection, that makes us who we are. And it would also render, and this is an important point that I make in the book, and that I actually wish I could even go back and make a little clearer. It renders it renders that there is no difference between two identical selves and perfect duplicates. When you look at material things that are this way, that are reproducible, there's no really fundamental distinction that makes determinate the fact that this is not this other self. There is no distinction between a perfect duplicate and two identical selves. But we know they're not the identical selves because they occupy a different place. But that's trivially true. It's a brute explanation without any content.
So the souls could be essentially identical in their origin, the way they're created, and the only difference between our souls is then attached to our own experience, the bodies we were born in, the parents we had, our environment, etc. That's possible, right?
Yeah, well, that's a different question. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. But I would say, yeah, given what we know about bodies, it's conceivably possible that, yeah, I mean, well, body swapping is possible. It's conceivably possible.
Well, at any rate, in terms of distinguishing souls and the nature of souls, you say we are not animals. So it'd be easy to argue that, I mean, all animals have souls just like humans. The differences in the level of complexity or ability So, and that also ties with the possibility of alien species. How do you conceive of your nature of the soul arguments in relation both to animals and then aliens?
Oh, I wasn't expecting that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Kind of. Yeah. We did mention that. I was. Let me switch gears a little bit. Let me see. Yeah. Animal souls. Yeah, that's the big objection. I mean, that's interesting because that's one of the big objections to the kind of view that I'm putting forward. That Descartes. There's a more complicated objection here, but the objection to Descartes' view is that, well, Descartes didn't really hold that animals have souls. They're just functional, kind of complex machines. And even though they give off these sounds that might intimate that they're in pain or something, they're not really in pain the way that we are in pain because they
Hmm.
don't have minds. And and so most people today would find that unintuitive. And so following from that, the sort of Cartesian view that I affirm does raise the question about, well, how do you, well, it raised a couple questions. I mean, I don't think they're that difficult, but it raises a question about, well, do animals actually have souls? And if they do have souls, if they are souls like our souls, then they would too have to be created like our souls are created. If they have complex sort of first person perspectives and consciousness, um, there's a kind of subjectivity that they occupy, like in the same way that we do. And that what makes sense of that is this sort of underlying primitive fact that um, that they just are their souls, and that what's sufficient for making their souls is this sort of primitive feature content, this primitive fact, or not property, because it's not something that others share in the same way that color is shared. Um, but they would have to be created like we are if they had the same kinds of souls. I don't know. I mean, at one level, that's coherent and it doesn't render anything problematic. Then you got to ask the question, well, that seems kind of uneconomical, right? And this is presses into some of the other questions about science. And science seems to study things that are really economical and kind of fit, and like we can make sense of them and according to these paradigms and according to these regular processes and that are governed by laws and things like that. And well, I mean, if God has to create every soul, then that seems like an uneconomical way of engaging with the world. Um, he could have been a bit more economical and come up with a simpler way of doing things. And I mean, maybe that's just the cost of the view. I don't see that as an overwhelming objection to the view, but that would be one view. But I mean, yeah, I kind of do take it that higher level canine animals have souls that are like our souls. Um, there's certainly more going on in them than mere meat machinery. They have they seem to have emotions and kind of at least some rudimentary first person perspective. Um, Not a complex, necessarily robust person perspective that humans do, uh, but something rudimentary or low level. Um, and that seems to be perfectly um, coherent and compatible within a Cartesian worldview. Um, as far as aliens, it's conceivable, of course, that aliens could have souls as well. That would be that at least biologically would have complex differences from the biological histories that our bodies do. I don't know what that would be, but it would open up the possibility that's a possibility. You could have other rational agents that are actually conscious in robust first person ways. That's at least coherent. It may not be real or actual, but it's at least coherent to conceive of that. I don't see any reason why they couldn't have different biological histories and still have a kind of soul like we do that has robust rational capacities and first person consciousness.
And
Um,
it could continue after death of the body in some other form.
right.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to think of animals like dogs and chimpanzees, but then go, okay, how about insects? It's like they
Yeah.
have, okay, they just have a tiny little soul or a negligible soul, but it's beyond our understanding, obviously. Okay, well, let's get into more the meat then of what really your case is for divine creationism. What is, I mean, you've already talked about it at some level, but if you can get into the meat of your divine creationism. And then along with that, the different options, which include theistic dualism and theistic idealism.
Yeah. So I get into the thick of this a bit toward the end of the book in terms of offering explanations for creationism. And again, I'm offering that this older view called the creation of the soul, or that souls are created ex nihilo, out of nothing, and they're not created ex materia, out of material or out of underlying material, but it's just the old notion that was common throughout church history, affirmed by many of the fathers, not all the fathers, church fathers, affirmed by Thomas Aquinas. It's the predominant view within Roman Catholicism and within Reformed scholasticism, maybe within Eastern Orthodoxy, but it's the predominant view throughout church history is the view of creationism. Um, and it's the view that I define in the book as being directly that there is some sort of causal explanation or causal agency that is responsible, that directly and immediately creates the entity in question, the soul, namely, and that the agency of this being that seems to be implicitly like us, or we like it, that has agency, that has makes choices, that has this discriminatory abilities, can discriminate between options and things of that sort, makes a choice and just makes it happen, that this soul is created directly and immediately. It's created directly in that it doesn't come about through any sort of other mediatorial process, like biological evolution. There might be a sense in which this structural capacities or powers of which the soul is inherits early on is mediated, but that doesn't mean that uh, it mediates the soul. So it's direct, it's immediate, without mediation. The causal contribution is not made, at least in terms of its existence, is not made by the biological biological process, biological accidents, um, the biological stuff, um, as it were. So you might make a distinction between direct and immediate, and you could say maybe that it is direct, but it's mediated in some way in terms of its coming into existence or something. Maybe you could make that slight distinction, although probably the traditional sense is creationism is that it's created directly and immediately, and that the causal terminus of the causal chain is just the agency of God or the being causally doing it, and that's what brings it about. And so that's what's important for making sense of the causal chain. Um, so um, you might distinguish that, say, from traducianism, which is another prominent view within church history, although it's not the most popular view, is creationism. And but it's gained more prominence in recent history amongst Christian philosophers and Christian theologians today because they see that it has so many. A lot of them say that it has so much resonance and resources for making sense of like biological evolution and the fact that we come about through this biological process and things like that. And there, I mean, there may be some relevance to that. I mean, J.P. Moreland in his book Body and Soul and his later works where he's developed it further, he argues that rather than creationism, he argues for a kind of traducianism of the soul. Traducianism is the view that hints its origins that the soul is um, a product in some way of underlying particularities or parts that give rise to a new soul. So it's Purturient to nature, as some philosophers would call it, that it has parts that give rise to it, or that it is fissile in nature, which is common amongst panpsychist explanations of the soul today, especially those who are more theistic inclined. But panpsychists would say something like that souls are fissile in nature and fusible, that you can fissile, so you could, like an atom, when an atom splits and two atoms come out of it or something like that, they can fuse back together and make a new one. So souls are something like that. You might be able to have some sort of traducianism that's similar to creationism in the way that I'm describing. And this is where the book is strongly creationist, but it might leave open some room for some kind of traducianism, where souls are created directly by God, where the causal contribution is created ex nihilo. It's the material is not somehow causally contributing to its existence, but in some way the mediation of its existence is the material or the immaterial process of the parents or something like that. That would be I mean, that sounds probably a little esoteric, but I mean, I'm kind of interested in that possibility. But the more fundamental intuition about the creation of the soul seems to be right, and the tradition seems to be right there in its estimation. The less prominent view or popular view in Christian history is called kind of a pre-existence view of the soul. And I'm not sure what to make of this. I mean, this is common in the Platonic traditions. It's common in somebody like Origen, as we mentioned earlier. Not Origen as sort of history, but Origen as the person, the theologian.
Right.
And he would say that that souls pre-existed their bodies, and that some souls even existed in heaven in a pre-bodily state, and that they kind of fell to earth due to original sin and assumed a body and lived in that body, and that was part of the original sin or fall of humankind. And in the way that they would exist in a heavenly state prior to the bodily, they will exist again post bodily in a heavenly state. And so that's certainly a view affirmed in Christian history amongst some, although it seems problematic given, I guess, what we do know from Scripture and from most of the traditions, sort of wise reflections. But I don't know anybody really defending that view anymore. And I mean, actually, I've tried to find people who would defend that because I wanted them to write and defend it and argue some sort of thick defense of it, but I don't know anybody who does it. I'm sure there is somebody in the East or something, like maybe an Eastern theologian and somewhere, but I haven't found anyone. So
how about theistic dualism and theistic idealism?
yeah, so theistic dualism and idealism are two different broad explanations of kind of frameworks for how we think about God in relation to the world. Theism is fundamental. The mind is central as explaining in both views. At least in some ways, theistic dualism is a form of idealism, at least in a sort of minimalist way, that minds are central in explaining the world. Minds are central epistemically to making sense of the world. Minds are central in making sense of values in the world. And so, in some minimalist way, theistic dualism is a version of theistic idealism. But more theistic idealists are often going in different directions and taking this further. And they would say that what would distinguish them would be to say that how they conceive of bodies or material would be that bodies or materials just are ideas in some ways, and bodies don't exist in any substantial way. This would be the view of someone like Bishop Berkeley, and but they are the physical world and physical things are couched in a mental reality in a way that they do not have independent substantial existence themselves. And so, in some ways, it would actually make more sense of, or it would be easier to make sense of bodies. As dualists, we take it for granted commonsensically that there are two distinct types of things, and there are two distinct types of substances, the bodies and the minds. And so that is what follows commonsensically or intuitively. Um, but um, yeah, so I explain those two positions, and I kind of leave it open. I don't I don't go any further in defending one or the other. I mean, my inclinations are probably just to say that theistic dualism is probably true, and it's a little harder to argue against idealism, a more robust idealism, but it's also harder in some ways um, to solidify it and defend it as being the right or true option. Um, so, but something like a kind of theistic dualism with its minimalist idealist assumption that minds are central to explaining parts of the world, values in the world. The minds have some role to play in underwriting aspects of even physical reality is important. And but again, our conception of theism has um, implies this sort of mental, fundamentally mental nature rather than some sort of naturalistic universe. And so those two ideas sort of go hand intimately kind of go hand in glove. They're together. When we conceive of theism, we're conceiving of a mind of some sort that makes choices and things of that sort. So that seems to be fundamental to reality. There's some kind of fundamental subjectivity reality that needs to be the starting point for how we make sense of the rest of the world because of this origins question that is at the heart of reality. And if we get that wrong, then it has a ripple effect in how we view the rest of the world. And I think we've seen that in secular naturalistic um, frameworks or paradigms where when they look out into the world, there is a natural sort of conditioned response to see it in a disenchanted way. There's a whole set of literature on that. I only intimate at it in the book. I'm suggestive. I don't get into it in detail, but I say this is the fundamental starting point. We got to get this right. And this origins questions really does point us to theism as the fundamental explanatory starting point, not naturalism or secularism, which leads to a disenchantment with the world, where the world really is not really beautiful anymore. And so there is this kind of poetic starting point that I'm pressing at, with all the analytic language that's there. There's something poetic about the soul.
Okay, so, but you have this quote, it is here that we begin to see some implications for reality in what we've just been discussing. So, particularly, how does that reality relate to the reality of the life and mission of the church?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a big question. That's a big question. it's a big question that I don't deal with in the book directly at all. Um, I deal with it to some extent, in my introduction to theological anthropology that was out a few years back. Um, but in this book, obviously, I'm doing a sort of natural theology. So I think I kind of get to that point where where I think natural theology may kind of, in some sense, get us as far as we can, and insofar as the soul is connected to God, and it gives us sort of perspectival epistemic slant on the world that is the starting point. But then it opens up this whole new world about, um, you know, um, what does it mean to live in a fundamentally theistic world, a mental world, a world that's explained by minds and not by natural processes. It opens up all this whole new world and all these questions about how we think then about nature. I think it has implications for how we think about nature as not certainly not merely a mechanistic system, but as something else. Uh, so it it points us actually to ask further implicit questions that I don't ask directly in the book, and even to ask questions about revelation itself, more specific revelation that arguably we find in the Bible or something like that, that gives us a fuller picture of what's going on in the world and what's going on in nature, and the fact that nature is not just nature, um, but it's creation. It's a creation, and those are two different concepts. Alistair McGrath, in his book on nature, he gives a pretty interesting sort of conceptual landscape on different notions of nature that have been used throughout the history of science and religious reflections. And for him, as a Christian doing theology, he says, well, he says we need to take nature as a created reality and come from that vantage point. And so I think this points us in that direction to raise those further questions about revelation and about more specifics and particular questions about who God is, who human is, kind of the old, just standard systematic theological questions about who they are and how revelation can fill in the gaps, and even fill in the gaps about the rest of nature itself. So it opens up in once again an enchanted world, in which largely right now I think we live, at least in a sociological sense, in a disenchanted world because of secularism and naturalism that are largely responsible for that. It opens up those kinds of questions and points us to ask those more pointedly, but also it opens up the possibility to re-enchant the world in a way that we see nature through the eyes of the soul, um, as a created reality itself, and as a reality that only makes sense of and is only made sense of in light of God. So the older sort of Renaissance emblematic vision of the world, kind of worldview, is live, and I think if if my thesis is right or something like it is right, then it opens up that possibility that we could have an emblematic vision of the world once again, something like what Edwards talks about in throughout his notebooks and his articles or entries on the image, where he's talking about nature as this communicated idea of the divine mind, such that there are different layers of reality, very Platonic in that way. There are different layers of reality that are really just communications of beauty, goodness, and truth from the mind of God. And so understanding nature, it's insufficient to understand nature purely in a sort of empirical way and being able to explain the mechanical processes of how soil and seed gives rise to flower or grass. That is insufficient, and it certainly doesn't capture the deeper, beautiful reality of God's intentions of what grass and flowers are intended to teach us, which Edwards has a whole lot to say about that. This kind of thesis that I'm offering about the soul and God as an epistemic, foundational epistemic lens opens up that possibility once again to think in that way, in a way that has been shut down for so long for secularists as well as for Christians. We just don't think that way. And actually, we think it probably, when we read some of what Edward says, we probably think it's pretty kind of queer, esoteric in a way that it's just implausible. But with a switch of our kind of perspective, those things might become kind of more plausible once again, where we begin to see beauty in nature again in a fuller way. Yeah.
Okay, and finally, a question I meant to ask earlier. You had talked some about referring to Joel Green and the Christian materialists, how they read the Hebrew scriptures in conceiving of the soul or the person. But we have the New Testament, and we have Paul, and he talks about the possibility of out-of-body experiences, etc. So from a New Testament perspective, how would you defend the notion of the existence of a soul?
Oh, from the New Testament.
Right.
Yeah, well, I think the best way to do it would be to follow um, John Cooper in his book Soul, Body, and Life Everlasting. I think he does a lot of the biblical groundwork for kind of exploring and developing this idea. But he argues that from a New Testament eschatological perspective, that there is a kind of disembodied state, and that's clear from various passages of Scripture. And it's certainly clear as a kind of worldview assumption that's in the sort of that permeates the minds of the people in the New Testament. And so he argues that if there is a disembodied state, an interim state, intermediate state, that seems to be clear from various passages, then that entails a kind of soul view of persons, that souls exist apart from their bodies, distinct from their bodies, that they have different possibilities than their bodies, that while their bodies are arguably within the grave and they're dead, that the souls are existing or persisting in a different way in the disembodied state, even as Thomas Aquinas would argue that they're in the presence of God. At least saints are in the presence of God during that disembodied state. And so I think that's an important discussion, and I think he lays the groundwork in his book. I build on it and try to make more specific arguments for it in my two previous books. But I think that's the way to really go about arguing from the New Testament for the soul. And if you deny that there's a disembodied state at all, doesn't mean that the soul's not true. It doesn't rule it out. But it certainly doesn't give it as much plausibility as the disembodied state does from a New Testament perspective. And I think the evidence is pretty overwhelming, certainly overwhelming in church history, that this is the way that most Christians have received revelation, that they've appropriated it. This is the way they've understood it and transferred it. And this has even become part and parcel of how they understand the overall gospel story. But I think even if we're just going to do bare exegesis, as so many materialists are pressing us to do, then I think the exegesis is clear itself as well. But when taken in light of the overarching gospel story of what God is doing toward us in his mission in redeeming us, that seems to play a pretty pivotal role in how it is that he's redeeming us, as we could spell out some of the particulars there. But one of the gospel implications is that not only is there a rational, plausible sense in which we actually do persist beyond the grave, which would make sense if we're souls and not just bodies, but also there's a rational framework in which to make sense of the kind of gospel good news that once we die, immediately we will be in the presence of God. And so we can say that with pastoral sensitivity to somebody, You will be in the presence of God. You've lived a life and you've been a faithful Christian. You'll be in the presence of God. Whereas the materialist cannot say that. So there's a real pastoral problem there, it seems to me, in their overarching gospel proclamation. You can't say to somebody who's a material body, you're going to be in heaven immediately with God upon death, somatic death. No, I mean, in fact, there's a sense in which you're going to have to wait until you get resurrected later on in time, sometime. We don't know when. So
right. Well, they may well experience it as instant if you're dead and then you don't have any sensory experience, even for 1,000 years or something. But at any rate,
that's true.
Okay, wow, great stuff there. You know, if I'm purely material, as long as I have a resurrection body someday, I'm going to be okay with it, but I prefer to think of it the way you do, that I do have a soul. I like that option better, but whatever comes, I'll take it.
Yeah, good. Yeah, me too.
All right, well, we've been talking about the soul today with Dr. Joshua Farris. So check out his book, The Creation of Self, A Case for the Soul. Follow the link below. So Dr. Farris, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Good to be with you. Thank you.
All right, peace to everyone. Please check out more videos from The Charge. Don't forget to click on like and hit the subscribe button.